The Middle Ages, often romanticized in modern imagination as a time of knights in shining armor, grand castles, and chivalric romance, harbored a much darker reality beneath its ornate tapestry of pageantry and feudal hierarchies. Beyond the gilded halls and verdant landscapes, medieval Europe was a society structured around strict social hierarchies, religious dogma, and often brutal legal systems. Among the most chilling aspects of this era was the widespread use of torture as both a punitive and coercive tool, a practice that permeated every level of society. The dark world of medieval torture was not random or chaotic. It was a calculated system designed to maintain control, enforce conformity, and instill fear. Torture in the medieval period served multiple purposes, ranging from punishment for criminal behavior to interrogation for confessions, particularly in cases of alleged heresy or witchcraft. These practices were often justified under the guise of divine law or moral order, reflecting the pervasive influence of the Church in legal and social life. In many regions, especially within the Holy Roman Empire, torture was codified within legal frameworks, with authorities considering it a legitimate method for eliciting truth from suspects who might otherwise resist confessions. What set this period apart from modern practices, however, was the absence of systematic protections for the accused. Suspected individuals, especially women, had little recourse and could be subjected to horrifying procedures on mere suspicion. The instruments of torture themselves were as varied as they were cruel, ranging from restraints and branding irons to devices designed explicitly to inflict maximum pain. The imagination of medieval craftsmen was chillingly inventive: racks that stretched the human body, thumbscrews that crushed fingers, iron cages that confined the victim for extended periods, and wheels that shattered bones. These instruments were meticulously engineered, often with mechanical precision, reflecting a grim ingenuity in the service of human suffering. The spectacle of torture was also inherently public in many cases, serving as a warning to communities. Cities and towns frequently staged executions or punishments in central squares, turning the suffering of the accused into a grim form of entertainment and moral instruction. The sight of a victim writhing on the rack or subjected to other torments was intended to remind citizens of the consequences of defying societal norms or religious commandments. Yet, while torture in general was a terrifying experience for all victims, historical records reveal a particularly sinister dimension: the gendered application of cruelty. Women were often subjected to torture methods that were uniquely designed to target their perceived vulnerabilities, reflecting the deeply patriarchal mindset of medieval Europe. The belief that women were morally weaker, more prone to sin, or inherently deceitful was widespread. This misogynistic lens shaped not only the types of accusations leveled against women, such as witchcraft, adultery, or defiance of male authority, but also the very methods of punishment designed for them. Devices and practices meant for women often carried a sexualized or humiliating component, exploiting societal anxieties about female sexuality and social roles. The rationale behind these gender-specific devices was rooted in both fear and control. Women who defied expected behaviors, whether by speaking out against authority, expressing sexuality outside societal norms, or challenging male-dominated institutions, were perceived as threats. Torture became a mechanism to reassert male dominance and enforce conformity. For instance, confessions extracted from women accused of witchcraft or heresy were often obtained through devices that caused intense physical pain while simultaneously inflicting public humiliation. The act of enduring torture in front of a crowd served to shame not only the individual but also any women who might consider resisting patriarchal control. Medieval torture was also closely intertwined with the legal and religious frameworks of the time. Ecclesiastical courts in particular wielded tremendous power, and their interpretation of justice often blurred moral and judicial lines. Accusations of heresy, blasphemy, or sexual impropriety could lead to women being imprisoned, tortured, and ultimately executed based on little more than rumor or personal vendetta. These practices were often justified through theological reasoning, Pain and suffering were sometimes framed as purification, a way for the body to reveal the truth or for the soul to atone. In practice, however, the outcomes were devastatingly arbitrary, leaving women especially vulnerable to the whims of accusers, judges, and executioners. Beyond the individual level, the prevalence of torture in the Middle Ages had profound societal consequences. The fear it instilled reinforced hierarchical structures, ensured obedience, and maintained the dominance of ruling classes and religious authorities. For women, this meant that their autonomy was constantly under threat, with the risk of physical and social punishment looming over even minor acts of defiance. Communities were structured in a way that normalized violence as a tool of governance, embedding the notion that control over women's bodies and voices was both acceptable and necessary for maintaining social order. The legacy of these practices extended beyond the immediate victims. It created a culture of fear, submission, and systemic oppression that persisted across generations. It is also crucial to recognize that the historical record we possess today, manuscripts, legal documents, and surviving torture devices, only provides a partial glimpse into the scale and nature of medieval torture. Much of the suffering endured by women remains undocumented, silenced by the very systems that inflicted it. Nevertheless, the surviving evidence paints a vivid and horrifying picture. The Middle Ages were not merely an era of feudal battles and political intrigue, but also a time when the bodies of women were instruments upon which social anxieties, moral panic, and institutionalized misogyny were brutally enacted. Ultimately, understanding the dark world of medieval torture requires us to confront the uncomfortable truth that cruelty was not an anomaly but a structured, accepted practice. It was a reflection of societal priorities, gender hierarchies, and the mechanisms of power that governed daily life. Women in particular faced a perilous existence in which their gender made them targets for uniquely cruel methods of control and punishment. By studying these practices, we gain insight into both the human capacity for invention in the service of oppression and the enduring consequences of systemic violence. It reminds us that history is not merely a record of triumphs and achievements, but also a testament to suffering and resilience, lessons that remain vital in our ongoing struggle for justice and equality in the grim landscape of medieval Europe. Torture was not a one-size-fits-all punishment. While men and women alike were subjected to excruciating physical torment, historical records reveal that women were often targeted with methods specifically designed to exploit their perceived vulnerabilities, social roles, and moral failings. This gender-specific approach to torture was rooted in deep-seated misogyny, reflecting the pervasive belief that women were morally weaker, more deceitful, and in need of strict control. The Middle Ages, a time of rigid social hierarchies and patriarchal authority, created an environment where female bodies were treated as instruments to enforce obedience and where suffering was calibrated to shame as much as to punish. The idea of gender-specific torture was closely linked to societal notions of honor, sexuality, and domestic hierarchy. Women were expected to adhere to strict codes of behavior dictated by both secular and religious authorities. Any deviation, from sexual transgression to vocal resistance against authority, could result in punishment designed not merely to inflict pain, but to humiliate. For instance, a woman accused of adultery, even on tenuous grounds, might be subjected to public shaming or physical torment that emphasized her failure as a wife or mother. Similarly, women accused of witchcraft faced devices and procedures specifically tailored to their gender, often involving sexualized elements that turned the act of punishment into an assertion of male dominance and societal control. One of the most infamous examples of gender-specific torture is the Scold's Bridle, also known as the brank. This device was essentially a metal mask or cage that encased the head, often with a gag inserted into the mouth to prevent speech. Women accused of gossiping, nagging, or otherwise challenging male authority could be forced to wear it for hours or even days. The bridle was designed to humiliate as much as to restrain, publicly marking the wearer as socially unacceptable. The mental anguish caused by such confinement, combined with the physical discomfort, was devastating. The Scold's Bridle symbolized the broader societal effort to silence women, reinforcing the notion that a woman's voice, especially one that dared to question authority, was dangerous and had to be forcibly controlled. Another horrifying example is the breast ripper, a device created to punish women accused of adultery, heresy, or other perceived sexual misdeeds. This tool, which came in several variations, was designed to tear the flesh from a woman's breasts, often while leaving the victim conscious. The mere existence of such a device reflects the extreme focus on female sexuality in medieval society. Men's sexual misdeeds were rarely punished in this manner. Women, in contrast, were often seen as the moral gate, keepers whose bodies were to be controlled, regulated, and, if necessary, tortured as a public warning to others. The breast, as a symbol of femininity and motherhood, became a site of punishment precisely because it carried such profound cultural significance. The Pear of Anguish is another chilling example. This metal instrument, shaped like a pear, could be inserted into the mouth, vagina, or even anus, and then expanded through a screw mechanism, causing excruciating pain and damage. Though historical records about its use are somewhat inconsistent, it is believed that the device was often applied to women accused of sexual transgressions or witchcraft. The Pear of Anguish illustrates the disturbing intersection of pain and humiliation, as the device was not only physically destructive, but also symbolically intended to expose and punish female sexuality. Through such devices, torturers reinforced the message that a woman's body could be manipulated and violated to serve societal needs. Torture for women was also closely tied to accusations of witchcraft, which became especially prevalent during the late medieval period. Women accused of consorting with demons or practicing magic were often subjected to tests and punishments designed specifically to elicit confessions. These procedures could include pricking the body with needles to find witches' marks, dunking tests, or other invasive acts that exploited both physical vulnerability and societal expectations of female modesty. The connection between gender and torture in these cases was explicit. Women were often seen as more susceptible to evil, more prone to deception, and therefore more likely to require harsh, gendered forms of interrogation to reveal truths that would vindicate the authorities. The psychological dimension of gender-specific torture cannot be overstated. Devices and practices targeting woe. Men were often designed to shame and intimidate entire communities. Public spectacles of female punishment served as cautionary tales, warning other women of the consequences of disobedience or sexual impropriety. The combination of physical pain, sexualized humiliation, and social ostracism created a profound climate of fear. Unlike male victims, whose punishment was often framed in terms of justice or retribution, female torture was inseparable from societal expectations of obedience, chastity, and subservience. In essence, gender-specific torture functioned as both a weapon and a lesson, enforcing a rigid, patriarchal order. The design of gender-specific torture devices also reflected the ingenuity and cruelty of medieval craftsmen. Many of these devices were mechanically sophisticated, engineered to maximize suffering while allowing authorities to maintain control with minimal effort. Adjustable metal screws, sharp spikes, and intricate locking mechanisms allowed torturers to customize punishment according to perceived guilt or social status. The very act of designing devices specifically for women demonstrates the extent to which society was willing to invest resources into controlling female behavior through violence. It also underscores the systemic nature of misogyny. Torture was not random, but a calculated strategy aimed at maintaining male dominance. Despite the horrors of gender-specific torture, it is essential to recognize the resilience of women during this period. Historical accounts, though scarce, reveal stories of courage and resistance. Women subjected to these devices sometimes endured in silence, sometimes used cunning to avoid detection, and in rare cases found ways to survive physically and psychologically against unimaginable odds. Their suffering, though recorded in fragmentary evidence, is a testament to the human capacity for endurance in The face of deliberate cruelty. Understanding gender-specific torture in medieval Europe provides insight not only into the mechanisms of punishment, but also into the broader social, cultural, and psychological frameworks of the time. These practices were a mirror reflecting the fears, prejudices, and values of a society structured to control and subjugate women. They were simultaneously instruments of pain, symbols of power, and tools of intimidation, highlighting the intersection of gender, authority, and violence. The legacy of these practices extends beyond history books. They serve as stark reminders of the dangers of systemic misogyny and the ways societies can weaponize fear against marginalized groups. In conclusion, gender-specific torture in medieval Europe represents one of the darkest aspects of human history. Devices like the Scold's Bridle, the breast ripper, and the Pear of Anguish were not mere instruments of physical pain. They were carefully designed tools of psychological and social domination. They reflected deeply entrenched beliefs about women's supposed weaknesses, moral failings, and social roles, while simultaneously reinforcing the power of male-dominated institutions. Studying these devices allows us to confront uncomfortable truths about the intersection of gender, power, and violence in history. It reminds us that oppression often takes both visible and invisible forms, and that the resilience of those who endured it deserves recognition, empathy, and remembrance among. The most horrifying aspects of medieval torture is the fact that certain devices were designed explicitly to target women. While men faced brutal punishments as well, the instruments intended for female victims often combined physical pain with sexualized humiliation, reflecting deeply ingrained societal anxieties about women's morality, sexuality, and autonomy. These devices were both a reflection of misogynistic beliefs and a mechanism of social control intended to subjugate, shame, and intimidate women. Several infamous instruments illustrate the cruelty and gendered design of medieval torture with chilling clarity. The Scold's Bridle, Brank. The Scold's Bridle, sometimes called the Brank, is perhaps one of the most notorious, gender-specific torture devices in history. Primarily used in England and Scotland, it was designed to punish women accused of scolding, a catch-all term for gossiping, nagging, or defying male authority. The bridle was a metal mask or cage that encased the woman's head, often with a metal piece inserted into the mouth to suppress speech. In some versions, the gag was fitted with spikes or sharp projections to cause discomfort or pain if the wearer moved her mouth. The psychological torment of the bridle was as significant as its physical discomfort. Wearing the device in public subjected women to humiliation, ridicule, and social ostracization. Townspeople would gather to witness the punishment, transforming the victim into a spectacle and reinforcing the notion that a woman's voice was dangerous and must be controlled. The bridle was not only a tool of enforcement, but a symbol of patriarchal authority, a way to silence women in a society that feared female influence and dissent. Some women were forced to wear the bridle for hours, days, or even longer, causing lasting physical injury and severe psychological trauma. The breast ripper, perhaps the most gruesome of the gender-specific torture devices, was the breast ripper, designed to punish women accused of adultery, heresy, or sexual transgressions. The device, which appeared in multiple variations, typically consisted of sharp iron claws or prongs that could be heated and then used to tear the flesh from the breasts. Its very design targeted a uniquely female aspect of the body, turning the symbol of motherhood and femininity into a site of punishment and terror. The breast ripper was not only intended to inflict extreme pain, but also to serve as a warning to other women. It functioned as both a punitive and performative tool, reinforcing the idea that female sexuality had to be controlled and monitored. In some historical accounts, women accused of sexual impropriety were paraded before the community after being tortured, their suffering serving as a moral lesson. The terror induced by the breast ripper extended beyond the individual victim. It reinforced societal norms and ensured conformity to rigid patriarchal expectations. The thought of such a device in use underscores the extent to which medieval society sought to punish perceived female deviance in ways that were both physically and symbolically devastating. The Pear of Anguish. The Pear of Anguish is another infamous device designed to inflict excruciating pain while simultaneously humiliating the victim. Shaped like a pear, the metal instrument could be inserted into the mouth, vagina, or anus and then expanded through a screw mechanism. The expansion caused severe tearing, crushing, and discomfort, and was often used as a method to punish women accused of adultery or other sexual transgressions. Historical records of the Pear of Anguish are somewhat inconsistent, with debates among historians about its exact use and prevalence. Nevertheless, its design clearly indicates a gender-specific application, particularly targeting female sexuality. In some accounts, the device was also used on women who resisted authority or were accused of witchcraft, highlighting the way medieval torture was intertwined with fear of female autonomy. The Pear of Anguish served a dual purpose. It physically punished the victim while reinforcing the perception that women's bodies were subject to social and moral control. Other devices targeting women. Beyond these infamous examples, a variety of other instruments were employed against women, each reflecting a particular fear or prejudice held by medieval society. The Iron Maiden, though often associated with male victims in popular imagination, was sometimes adapted for women, its interior lined with spikes that impaled the body while simultaneously confining it. The Witch's Chair, a device used during witch trials, forced women into contorted positions, often with spikes pressing against sensitive areas, to coerce confessions. Women accused of witchcraft were also subjected to tests like swimming trials, where their survival or drowning was interpreted as guilt or innocence, and pricking tests, in which suspected witches' marks were searched for with needles or pins. These procedures, though not always mechanical devices in the traditional sense, were gender-specific punishments designed to exploit social and bodily vulnerabilities. The psychological and social function of female torture devices. The creation and use of devices specifically for women reveal more than cruelty, they reveal a deliberate strategy of social control. Torture for women was rarely about justice in any rational sense. It was about maintaining patriarchal order and instilling fear. By targeting women's bodies, sexuality, and social roles, these devices served as tools to regulate behavior and reinforce societal norms. Public spectacles of torture communicated clear messages. Women who defied expectations would suffer visibly and horrifically. The gendered nature of torture also reflected broader societal anxieties. Medieval society often portrayed women as morally weak, deceitful, or dangerously seductive. Torture devices acted as a mechanism to subjugate these perceived threats, ensuring that women remained subordinate to male authority. In this sense, the devices themselves were as symbolic as they were physical. The act of wearing, enduring, or being subjected to these instruments represented both punishment for the individual and a cautionary tale for the entire female population. The legacy of gendered torture, the legacy of female-specific torture devices, is a chilling reminder of historical misogyny and the lengths to which societies will go to control women. These devices are preserved today in museums, illustrations, and historical texts, serving as tangible evidence of the cruelty that women endured. While modern societies no longer employ such devices, studying them provides insight into the intersection of gender, power, and violence in history. It allows us to understand how institutionalized oppressio can manifest in terrifyingly creative ways, and underscores the importance of vigilance against gender-based violence. Even centuries later, these instruments continue to evoke a visceral response. They are stark reminders of the vulnerability imposed by social hierarchies and the ways fear and power can be engineered to maintain control. The history of gender-specific torture teaches that cruelty is often culturally sanctioned, particularly when it aligns with societal prejudices, and that women have historically borne the brunt of such targeted oppression in medieval Europe. Torture was not merely an individual punishment. It was a social instrument designed to reinforce hierarchical structures, enforce conformity, and perpetuate fear. While both men and women were subjected to physical torment, Women bore a uniquely gendered form of suffering that extended far beyond the immediate pain inflicted by devices like the Scold's Bridle, the breast ripper, or the Pear of Anguish. The use of torture against women was intricately tied to societal anxieties about morality, sexuality, obedience, and the preservation of patriarchal authority. Understanding the societal role and impact of female-specific torture illuminates the pervasive control mechanisms of medieval communities and the long-lasting cultural ramifications of these practices. At the heart of gender-specific torture was the belief that women were inherently morally weaker, more prone to deception, and more susceptible to sin than men. This perspective, deeply rooted in both religious doctrine and secular law, framed women as perpetual threats to social order. The Church, in particular, played a central role in shaping and legitimizing these beliefs. Religious authorities frequently depicted women as the source of temptation, echoing biblical narratives such as Eve's fall from grace. Consequently, women were of 10 seen as morally culpable not only for their own actions, but also for their potential influence over others. Torture, then, became a tool to regulate female behavior, maintain moral purity, and assert male dominance. The societal role of female torture extended far beyond individual punishment. Public spectacles of punishment were a common practice in medieval towns and cities, turning victims into living cautionary tales. Women subjected to torture were often displayed in town squares, marketplaces, or outside church grounds where their suffering could be witnessed by the entire community. This public aspect served several purposes simultaneously. It humiliated the victim, reinforced societal norms, and instilled fear in others. By making examples of women who transgressed perceived social or moral boundaries, authorities communicated clear warnings. Deviation from prescribed roles would result in severe consequences. Gender-specific torture also reinforced social hierarchies within households and communities. Women were expected to adhere to strict codes of obedience to husbands, fathers, and male authorities. Disobedience, whether verbal defiance, sexual autonomy, or resistance to domestic duties, could trigger punishments that combined physical pain with psychological and social humiliation. Devices like the Scold's Bridle explicitly punished women for speaking out, framing vocal expression as dangerous or inappropriate. By silencing women and reinforcing the expectation of submission, torture became a mechanism through which patriarchal authority was both maintained and normalized. The underlying message was clear: women were subordinate, and deviation from that role was unacceptable. The use of torture against women was also closely linked to the policing of sexuality. Female sexuality was heavily scrutinized in medieval Europe, with strict norms governing chastity, fidelity, and reproductive behavior. Women accused of adultery, promiscuity, or sexual impropriety faced punishment that was both physically excruciating and symbolically loaded. Devices like the breast ripper or the Pear of Anguish transformed the female body into a site of moral enforcement, punishing women for perceived sexual transgressions while simultaneously sending a warning to others. Sexualized torture reflected broader societal anxieties about controlling women's reproductive and sexual agency, and reinforced the notion that female bodies were subject to public and institutional regulation. Torture also functioned as a tool of social control in the context of witchcraft accusations. Women, particularly those who were unmarried, elderly, or otherwise marginalized, were disproportionately accused of witchcraft, often based on flimsy evidence or rumor. Torture was employed to coerce confessions, which were then used to justify further persecution. These practices were not random acts of cruelty, but part of a broader societal system designed to maintain order and hierarchy. By targeting women and enforcing conformity through fear, communities could reinforce existing power structures and ensure adherence to social and religious norms. The psychological impact of gender-specific torture was profound. Beyond the immediate physical pain, women endured long-term trauma, shame, and social ostracism. Survivors often faced stigmatization, their reputations permanently damaged by public spectacle and moral condemnation. The fear of torture or public humiliation created a pervasive climate of anxiety for all women, influencing behavior and limiting autonomy. In this sense, the societal impact extended far beyond individual victims. The threat of gender-specific punishment functioned as a mechanism of collective control, shaping behavior across entire commune. Religious institutions played a dual role in the societal reinforcement of torture. Clergy often legitimized punishment by framing it as divine retribution or moral correction, asserting that suffering could purify the soul or reveal the truth. This religious justification further entrenched the practice within society, providing moral and spiritual rationale for the oppression of women. At the same time, religious doctrine contributed to the stigmatization of women accused of transgressions, particularly in cases of adultery or witchcraft. Female victims were frequently portrayed as morally corrupt or spiritually dangerous, ensuring that their suffering served both a punitive and instructive purpose. The societal consequences of gender-specific torture were long-lasting, shaping attitudes toward women for generations. The normalization of public punishment, sexualized violence, and social shaming reinforced gender hierarchies that persisted well beyond the medieval period. These practices embedded the idea that women were inherently subordinate and that control over female bodies, behavior, and speech was acceptable. The cultural memory of these methods continues to inform discussions of gendered violence and systemic oppression, reminding us of the deep historical roots of misogyny. Furthermore, the societal impact of female torture extended to the intergenerational transmission of fear and compliance. Witnessing or hearing of such punishments reinforced social norms for younger women, teaching them to internalize obedience and self-regulation. Families, communities, and local authorities all participated, directly or indirectly, in sustaining the culture of fear. In this way, gender-specific torture functioned not only as an immediate tool of repression, but as a mechanism for long-term social conditioning. Despite the horror and oppression embedded in ESE practices, historical accounts reveal instances of resilience and resistance. Some women endured torture with remarkable courage, maintaining dignity in the face of extreme suffering. Others found subtle ways to subvert authority or protect themselves within oppressive systems. These acts of endurance highlight the human capacity for resilience and provide a counterpoint to the narrative of domination and control. In conclusion, the societal role and impact of female torture in medieval Europe were multifaceted and deeply consequential. Torture served not only as a tool of physical punishment, but as an instrument of social control, moral regulation, and psychological domination. By targeting women in ways that exploited their bodies, sexuality, and social roles, medieval societies reinforced patriarchal hierarchies and perpetuated a culture of fear. The public spectacle, moral framing, and religious sanctioning of torture ensured that its effects extended far beyond individual victims, shaping behavior and attitudes across communities and generations. Understanding this historical reality offers critical insight into the systemic nature of gendered violence and highlights the importance of recognizing and challenging the enduring legacy of misogyny in contemporary society. Legacy of medieval torture devices designed specifically for women is a haunting reminder of the cruelty, misogyny, and social control embedded in past societies. While these instruments, the Scold's Bridle, the breast ripper, the Pear of Anguish, and others, may seem relics of a distant and barbaric era, their implications stretch far beyond the Middle Ages. They offer insight not only into the technological and physical dimensions of historical torture, but also into the broader cultural, social, and psychological forces that allowed such gendered violence to thrive. Studying these devices and the society that produced them provides a lens through which to examine the mechanisms of oppression, the resilience of those who endured it, and the enduring relevance of these lessons in modern times. At a basic level, the historical artifacts of female-specific torture serve as tangible evidence of how fear, control, and ideology intersected to enforce social hierarchies. The deliberate targeting of women reflects a societal preoccupation with regulating female behavior, morality, and sexuality. Torture was a means not only of punishing individual transgressions, but of maintaining the patriarchal order itself. Public displays of torture and humiliation functioned as warnings, communicating to all women the potential consequences of disobedience. In this sense, these devices were instruments of systemic oppression, meticulously engineered to exploit both physical vulnerability and social conditioning. The legacy of these devices also lies in their symbolic power. Even centuries after their active use, they continue to provoke strong emotional responses, illustrating the universal human understanding of pain, fear, and social control. Museums, historical archives, and illustrated manuscripts preserve these devices as reminders of the extreme lengths to which societies have gone to regulate and dominate women. Viewing or studying these instruments is a visceral experience. The imagination is forced to confront not only the physical agony they could inflict, but also the pervasive social, cultural, and psychological dynamics that gave rise to them. Historically, the influence of gender-specific torture devices extended beyond immediate punishment. They contributed to long-standing cultural narratives about women, reinforcing stereotypes that portrayed women as morally weak, deceitful, or inherently dangerous. These narratives were institutionalized through legal codes, religious teachings, and communal practices, ensuring that the oppression of women was both systemic and socially normalized. Over time, the fear generated by the threat of torture shaped behavior, speech, and social interactions, limiting female autonomy and reinforcing patriarchal control. Even when the devices themselves fell out of use, the underlying attitudes and social conditioning persisted, influencing generations of women and men alike. The study of these devices also provides critical insight into the role of technology in the service of oppression. Medieval craftsmen applied mechanical ingenuity to the design of torture instruments, creating devices that maximized pain, prolonged suffering, and imposed social shame. The Scold's Bridle, with its restrictive cage and gag, and the Pear of Anguish, with its screw expansion mechanism, illustrate the intersection of technological skill and moral cruelty. This historical fact underscores a broader lesson. Tools, technologies, and inventions are not inherently benevolent or neutral. They are shaped by the social and ethical context in which they are created and can be employed to perpetuate oppression. Recognizing this dynamic encourages modern reflection on the ethical responsibilities inherent in technological innovation. Another aspect of the legacy of female-specific torture is its enduring psychological and cultural resonance. These devices were not simply instruments of pain. They were designed to produce fear, shame, and social ostracism, leaving lasting marks on both individual victim and their communities. Historical accounts reveal that the trauma inflicted by torture could extend far beyond the immediate moment, influencing survivors' mental health, social relationships, and community standing. Moreover, the public nature of many punishments ensured that the lessons of fear and submission were communally reinforced. The psychological mechanisms of control embedded in these practices are strikingly relevant to contemporary discussions about systemic oppression, abuse, and the ways fear is used to maintain hierarchies of power. The historical lessons from gender-specific torture are multifaceted. Firstly, they illuminate the dangers of institutionalized misogyny and the consequences of societal beliefs that devalue and control women. The devices themselves, horrifying as they were, cannot be separated from the cultural, legal, and religious frameworks that made their use acceptable. Recognizing this interplay is crucial for understanding how oppression operates, not as isolated acts of cruelty, but as systemic, socially sanctioned practices. Secondly, the endurance of such devices in cultural memory highlights the importance of historical awareness. By confronting the darkest aspects of our past, we gain perspective on contemporary issues, including gender-based violence, sexual exploitation, and institutionalized discrimination. Modern society can draw important lessons from this history. The legacy of medieval torture devices emphasizes the importance of vigilance against any social, legal, or technological systems that enable the targeting of marginalized groups. Gender-based oppression may no longer take the form of spikes, braces, or iron clamps, but it persists in subtler forms: economic disparity, legal inequality, societal stereotyping, harassment, and institutional bias. Understanding the historical roots of misogyny encourages proactive measures to prevent similar patterns of oppression in contemporary contexts. Education, advocacy, and systemic reform are all tools that help ensure that the horrors of the past are neither forgotten nor repeated. Another significant lesson is the power of resilience and survival in the face of systemic oppression. While the women subjected to these devices endured unimaginable pain and humiliation, historical records also reveal instances of endurance, clever resistance, and courage. Some women managed to survive physically, psychologically, or socially, challenging the very systems that sought to control them. Their stories, often fragmentary, underscore the human capacity for resilience and the ways individuals navigate, resist, and endure oppressive systems. By studying these narratives, modern audiences can gain both inspiration and insight into strategies for confronting injustice today. Finally, the legacy of these devices underscores the importance of historical preservation and scholarship. Museums, academic studies, and public history projects that document medieval torture serve a dual purpose. They honor the memory of those who suffered and educate future generations about the social, cultural, and ethical implications of such practices. Preservation allows for critical reflection not only on the specific instruments of torture, but on the broader social structures that made their use possible. Engaging with this history challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, to question authority, and to advocate for justice in ways that prevent the repetition of similar abuses. In conclusion, the legacy and historical lessons of female-specific torture devices in medieval Europe are profound. They remind us of the extreme cruelty that can arise when social, cultural, and religious systems intersect to control, shame, and punish women. They highlight the intersection of technology, psychology, and ideology in the enforcement of oppression. They emphasize the enduring impact of trauma, the importance of resilience, and the need for historical awareness. Perhaps most importantly, they challenge modern society to confront ongoing forms of gender-based oppression, ensuring that the suffering of the past informs ethical, social, and legal action in the present. By studying these dark chapters of history, we honor the memory of those who endured unimaginable cruelty, learn the mechanisms of systemic oppression, and reaffirm our commitment to justice, equality, and human dignity.